This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 681, entitled, "When I heard that Susan Wojcicki had died, I did a little jig." Description. This flyer explains why I did a little jig upon hearing that Susan Wojcicki, the former CEO of YouTube, had died at the age of 56 from lung cancer. That woman was the most hated in the manosphere. This flyer tries to explain why she was so hated, so that if her own family can understand the source of that hatred, coming from men who are trying to liberate half the population, the male half, then perhaps many other people, including monoconscious feminists, will understand as well, and then be motivated to help the cause of the liberation of men from the horrible gender crimes that women commit against men. Now the flyer itself. When I heard that Susan Wojcicki had died, I did a little jig. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Susan Wojcicki died recently of lung cancer, so I googled to see if she had been a heavy smoker, but found nothing about her being a smoker or not, close brackets, leaving behind a husband and 5 kids. Her husband wrote a touching obituary to her that showed he loved her, and I suppose so did her kids. So why am I being so callous towards her, saying that when I heard the news that she had died, I did a little jig, that is, a little dance? Why? If ever her husband or one of her kids gets to read/see this flyer, then I hope they will begin to understand why their wife/mother was the most hated woman in the manosphere for her fostering as a feminist of feminist channels, in brackets, as the former CEO of YouTube, and her, in capital letters, deletion of masculist channels. Personally, I so hated that woman for her sexist, hypocritical bigotry, for her suppression of the liberation of half, capital letters, the Earth's population, that my immediate reaction on hearing of her death was karma. If her husband or one of her kids can be made to understand why she was the most hated woman in the manosphere, then perhaps there may be many other people who can be persuaded to learn to hate her as well, since from a biconscious masculist point of view, she deserved to be hated. The problem with most feminists is that they are what the masculists call monoconscious. That is, the only gender politics that they have ever heard of is feminism. Feminism is a deeply misandrist, gynocentric ideology that teaches women and society nothing, capital letters, about how women oppress men. To do that would be to take responsibility for women's lives, to be adult. But so much of feminism is about blaming men for nearly all of women's problems, instead of facing up to the reality that a lot of women's problems are a result of women's own inadequacies. To blame men all the time is childish, and masculists, men's libbers, are royally fed up, in capital letters, with the constant feminazi bitchery of monoconscious feminists. Because nearly all feminists at the time of writing, that's August 2024, are monoconscious, they know nothing of masculism, which is the male equivalent of the feminist movement, out to liberate men from the oppressions of the traditional male role of working for a woman for decades of his life, and aiming to rid the planet of laws that discriminate against men. One of the core teachings of the masculists is that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, that women oppress men too, and in fact worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades, which make them a lot more serious than the relatively mild ways that men oppress women. Damascus, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is seen as small beer in comparison to the worst three ways that women oppress men, the big three, as they are known by the Masculists, namely women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. To have one's masculine consciousness raised is to become familiar with these horrible gender crimes committed by women against men. The more conscious one becomes of these horrible gender crimes, the greater the hatred felt by masculists against the gender criminal women who commit these awful crimes against men. Susan Wojcicki was monoconscious. She would have to be, since a woman as intelligent and capable as she was could never have cancelled masculist channels the way she did. In brackets, I had 2 of my masculist channels deleted by feminist-dominated YouTube in 2019 and 2023, close brackets. If she had been bi-conscious, brackets, that is, as familiar with masculist ideas as feminist ideas, seeing clearly that gender oppression is a two-way street and that women oppress men worse, close brackets. She did what she did based on her monoconscious feminist beliefs. Typically, monoconscious feminists who know nothing of masculist ideas interpret masculist anger and hatred of women's gender crimes against men as just more male misogyny. So it's something to be resisted. And what better way to resist and fight misogyny than to delete, capital letters, Masculist and MGTOW, men going their own way, channels. This resistance of misogyny by monoconscious feminists makes perfect sense to them, since all their lives, for the past 6 decades of the feminist monopoly of gender politics, they have been taught, brainwashed, that gender oppression is a one-way street. As feminists, they think nothing negative about the traditional male gender role of working for a woman, paying for her for decades of his life. They certainly don't see it as manslavery. Feminists take the traditional male role for granted. They don't question it. They expect it. The feminists who took over the divorce courts in the 70s brought with them their traditional expectation of men, that is, as cash machines who, quote, exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies, unquote. These monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges then started butchering one father in 4 by stripping him of custody of his kids with a 90% probability in many Western countries, forcing him to give his house to his divorcing ex-wife so she can raise her kids in it, giving half his wealth and stuff to her, forced to make child payments to his kids, whom he's barely allowed to see, and his ex-wife is a real fluffy, in brackets, an abusive masculine term for a traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him for decades, close brackets. He is made to pay her alimony, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, in brackets, FIP, F-I-P, equals financially independent persons, close brackets, so that she continues to parasite off the labour and money of her ex-husband after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Masculists have 2 main enemies, the fluffies and the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges. We hate them so much we are at war against them and aim to wipe them off the face of the earth by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable deaths, manless, sexless, loveless, babyless and spat at, utterly rejected, both socially and sexually. Masculists see that women now have a career window of half a century thanks to men giving women science-based medicine, in brackets, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, close brackets. that men gave women the pill, household gadgets, higher education. So masculists now stand up, point the finger at women, telling them that, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery will get you killed." Masculists put tremendous moral pressure on women to be FIPs, since masculists see clearly that the fipping of women will go a long way towards solving many of men's gender issues. Masculists aim to create a FIP society in which both sexes are socialized and educated to be FIPs, so that fluffies die out, so that the divorce courts can be based on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, the mother and the father. Manslavery will become a thing of the past, since all women will be FIPs, who expect to pull their financial weight by fipping up in their youth and young adulthood. Masculists want the men fairing of the gender laws, that so bitterly discriminate against men. For example, the lack of a para, that's paternity rejection right. Masculists want men to have the same legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy as women have, that is, the MARA, maternity rejection right, aka abortion right. The fact that women have the MARA, but men don't have the PARA, makes masculists murderously angry and hateful at women who commit the awful gender crime against men of forced fathering. That is, forcing a man to pay for 2 decades for a kid he never wanted in the first place. Masculists want the PARA legislated, along with the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth, for all births, to block women's horrible gender crime against men of paternity fraud. That is, where the woman lies to her man that the kid growing in her is his when she knows it's not. Masculists want paternity fraudster women put in jail for 15 years, since paternity fraud is a greater gender crime than rape, which typically gets a man a 10-year jail sentence. Masculists want the establishment of GECs, GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is certainly not the case today in today's gynocentric society in gender political terms. So if you're a monoconscious feminist, you're probably beginning to see why masculists have such a contempt and hatred for monoconscious feminists, whom masculists see as arch-sexist hypocrites, since female oppression of men is far worse than vice versa. Masculists are now publicly and hatefully expressing their contempt for monoconscious feminists, seeing them as misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi cunts, who masculists punish severely by totally ignoring them, exterminating them effectively. This process is already well underway with young men in the US. In 2022, the reputable polling company Pew, that's PW, Research Center, found that nearly 2/3, in brackets 63%, of young men in the US refused to date women, claiming that young women were undateable because they had been poisoned with feminist ideas that made them repulsive to young men. So these young women are finding increasingly that there are way too few young men who are willing to date them. So we are now seeing hundreds of TikToks of young women in tears expressing their pain that they can't find a boyfriend. A growing number of female masculists are complaining that monoconscious feminists have caused young men to reject dating to such a degree that even these female masculists are having a hard time finding a boyfriend. So these female masculists, who are now coming out of the woodwork in large numbers, are learning to hate the monoconscious feminists as much as the biconscious masculists do. So it looks likely that when both sexes, in huge numbers, hate monoconscious feminists, then monoconscious feminism will die out. Nearly all monoconscious feminists will convert themselves to being biconscious, and hence will have a higher chance of finding a boyfriend. Bi-conscious feminists are much nicer to be with for masculists and men in general, since these women have had their feminazi bitchiness at men for the ways that men oppress women, as taught them by monoconscious feminism, cancelled, capital letters, by their female masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. Masculists have a very effective strategy to force monoconscious feminists to become bi-conscious, in brackets, that is, to learn some masculism, close brackets. And that is to target these women's boyfriends / husbands / partners, teaching these men masculism so that these men become bi-conscious. If their feminist girlfriends remain monoconscious, then these now bi-conscious boyfriends will view the monoconsciousness of their girlfriends as sexist, hypocritical bigotry, will become disgusted with them and then dump them. These now dumped monoconscious feminists will then see their exes starting up relationships with bi-conscious feminists, and that will motivate them strongly to convert themselves to bi-consciousness, and later to vote with men, to mend further gender laws, by reforming the divorce courts, by setting up the GECs, by legislating the para, the OPTAB, etc., to create a FIP society, so that young men are prepared to be fathers again, so that we don't wipe ourselves out. To a well-informed bi-conscious masculist, a monoconscious feminist is a bigot, a monoconscious feminazi bigot, that's MFB. Masculists aim to wipe out such women by forcing them to rot on the shelf, by total neglect. Masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminists, effectively exterminating them. Masculist soldiers kill their enemies. Fluffies are our enemies.